Right, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Andy Penn, the recently outgoing CEO and Managing Director of Telstra. Andy's career spans more than 4 decades across 3 different industries: telcos, financial services and shipping. He joined Telstra in 2012 as Chief Financial Officer. In 2014, he took on the additional responsibilities of Group Executive International, and of course in 2015, he took the helm as CEO. Please join me in welcoming Andy Penn.
Well, thank you very much, Lucy, and good morning, everybody. Can I begin by adding my acknowledgement that we meet today on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. And can I also say thank you to the National Farmers Federation for inviting me here to speak today. And Fiona, I think I sense the same enthusiasm that you do. I've had a couple of opportunities to travel and engage at conferences and events over the last 2 or 3 months, and I must admit it's something that I've missed very significantly. I was in Barcelona literally a few weeks ago at the Mobile World Congress for the mobile telecommunications industry, at which we had 60,000 delegates, and I find that one of the benefits of going to an event like that or an event like this is you get to talk about all of the issues that we currently see before us, but we get to talk about them through the lens and hear about them and discuss them through the lens of lots of different participants in the industry, whether it's government, primary producers, representative bodies or providers like Telstra and telecommunications. And I find it really helps increase the level of conviction we have around our strategy and what we need for our industry. We've enjoyed a very strong relationship with the National Farmers Federation, one that's been built over many years, in fact decades. And I want to recognise therefore the President Fiona Simpson, CEO Tony Maher, and also their board, and thank them and look forward to many more years ahead in partnership together. I also want to applaud the NFF in its leadership with a vision as demonstrated by your aspiration for the agriculture to become a $100 billion industry. I remember launching that with you and being with you, supporting that, Fiona, I think, can't remember, 2017, was it 2018, with the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull at the Sydney Showgrounds, and that was, when you think about it, it really was a truly inspirational moment, because it seems as though it makes complete sense now, but I think at the time it was incredibly bold. Also for initiatives that, such as last night, the celebration and the promotion of diversity within the industry. I really also want to recognise that and congratulate you for such a great initiative. Diversity is something that's also very important to Telstra. Similarly, I want to applaud the Australian government for its vision for Australia to become a world-class digital economy by 2030. Because as a technology company and as Australia's leading telecommunications provider, we see huge benefits from these visions. But there are also, of course, risks of not pursuing them, risks of falling behind and losing competitiveness. Now, as Lucy just mentioned, as you may have read, I will be stepping down in my role as the CEO of Telstra in September later this year, after 7.5 years in the job. And that's a decision that I've made with very mixed emotions. I love Telstra. I love the role that we play in keeping Australians connected and supporting the digital economy. However, the company is in a great place. We have fabulous succession in place, and I really want to continue to make an impact on important issues such as digital leadership, technology innovation, and cybersecurity. But I want to do that in a different way, and so the time is the right time for me. I know that there is always more to do, but Telstra is in a very different place than it was 7 or 8 years ago. The one thing that strikes me, though, as I prepare to step down from the role and look to the future, is just how quickly that time has passed and how much digital adoption has accelerated, particularly during the last 2 to 3 years through the COVID pandemic. The other thing that strikes me, though, is just how much policy regulation has failed to keep pace with this change. And I believe that we will not achieve our aspiration of being a world-leading digital economy or a $100 billion ag sector by 2030 if we continue to regulate our technology and telecommunications sector as if they are still in the early 2000s. It's an obvious point, but I'm not sure that it's always fully appreciated or internalised, but telecommunications is the backbone of the digital economy. You do not or cannot access the internet other than through a telecommunications network. There is no digital economy without telecommunications, and of course there is no ag-tech sector without telecommunications. And that is why we need to get the policy settings right. Policy can be a pretty dry topic, but it is very, very important for regional and rural Australia. At the same time, telecommunications is hugely capital intensive. We spend billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars, every year on infrastructure and new technologies, and we make decisions that have decade-long implications. Whilst at the same time, technology innovation is moving very fast. So getting those decisions right is also crucially important. And what the last 7.5 years has shown me is that 2030 is going to be with us before we know it. So tackling that policy issue and that regulatory framework is also urgent. No single entity is responsible for regional and rural connectivity. It requires many parts and many people to play a role. Sometimes it feels like people believe Telstra is the only company responsible and that it owns the NBN. In fact, we certainly spend more money than anybody else, although it does seem like even within government there's confusion about whose role it is to provide different aspects of the telecommunications network, as we heard this morning. But at a national level, it's not just Telstra. Other service providers, satellite operators, state and federal governments are all accountable too. And at a local level, local councils and individuals play a role. There are a lot of moving parts, but the prize is huge if we can get it right. So, starting with the right vision is essential. And whilst this conference is about agriculture and farming, I'm going to focus my comments on the policy and regulatory landscape for telecommunications and technology, because I'm going to demonstrate to you why getting this right is important for the NFF's vision, for your vision, for the $100 billion to become a reality. I will also comment on what Telstra is doing about it in this space, including announcing a new program today, which we are calling Telstra Connected Communities, which will be a step change in how we show up in regional Australia. Let me start, though, with the policy framework for telecommunications and technology that Australian farmers need for the future. There are 5 key principles that this policy framework must follow. Firstly, we need to view our policy settings through the lens of Australia becoming a world-leading digital economy. Agriculture is already a very sophisticated, highly technical industry, and technology is transforming the sector, enabling a raft of new capabilities. Australian farmers already lead the world when it comes to efficiency and productivity. For some, the image of a farmer is somebody driving a tractor, but the new generation of primary producers can run their farms from an app on their phone while flying a drone and using a huge range of connected sensors, predictive analytics, and machine learning capabilities. We need to view agriculture through that lens. COVID has shown just how quickly policy changes can be made and embraced. During the height of the pandemic, we saw a huge acceleration in the adoption of telehealth, online learning, remote working, and e-commerce. This was achieved with fast tracking of numerous policy and regulatory changes to break down long-standing digital headwinds. As a nation, it is critical that we continue to build on that momentum, and one of the best ways to do that is to stop thinking about telecommunications in isolation and start thinking about it as a platform for the digital economy. In an agricultural context, digitisation will be revolutionary, bringing big data management technologies, smart sensors, artificial intelligence systems and predictive analytics into farming. In the face of worsening environmental challenges and accelerating climate change, it will also make the sector more efficient, more environmentally friendly and more resilient. The bottom line is telecommunications is the keystone to the digital economy, and every policy decision needs to be looked at through this lens. Secondly, our policy settings must be technology agnostic. In other words, we do not want regulation to determine the technology that we can use. I'm often asked, will 5G replace the NBN? Will low orbital satellites replace geostationary satellites? Will fibre replace cable? Will edge compute replace the cloud? And my answer is always the same. When we look to the future and the demand for more low latency bandwidth, we need all of these technologies and we need them all to advance. A technology agnostic approach ensures that technology choice is not directed by legislation or the regulatory environment, but rather by the evolving customer needs, technology advancements, and the feasibility of solutions. As an example, under the Universal Services obligations, we provide the standard telephone service through the copper network. It's a network that has served us well for many decades. It's a network I love, but it is ageing. It's ageing, it's susceptible to damage, it does break down, and it is hard to find parts. We have been advocating for change for many years so that we can use newer technologies to provide that essential lifeline to customers, which we know is so important to them. This was also a common theme in the many submissions to the recent Regional Telecommunications Independent Review Committee process, or otherwise known as RTIRC, which reported late last year. Another area where technology biases are impacted is in affordability. Telstra supports the introduction of a low-income NBN product available across all areas and all NBN technologies. Many regional and remote Australians are still choosing not to connect to the NBN, which prevents them from participating in the digital economy. Or they are choosing to only use a mobile service for connection at home, which in some cases may not be the best solution for them. In fact, because of these gaps, increasingly the mobile network is being seen as the solution to every telecommunications problem. Now, much as I love our mobile network, and it is clearly the best in Australia, and it is certainly amongst the best globally, there are other technologies that can play a role and which may be more suitable depending on the situation, particularly in regional and rural Australia. Thirdly, our policy settings have to be provider agnostic. What I mean here is that our regulations need to be orientated around the service being provided, not who is providing it. Today, there are many applications that provide similar services to telecommunications, but they are not regulated in the same way. Telecommunications companies operate within a massive regulatory framework. Telstra itself is subject of its own Act of Parliament. We operate under a carrier licence. We comply with both the general and there are specific provisions within consumer law for telecommunications. We comply with the Telecommunications Consumer Protection Code, the Telecommunications Sector Security Reforms Act. We have our own industry complaints ombudsman, to name just a few. Interestingly, we undertook a review recently that highlighted that we have almost 2,000 regulatory and legislative obligations to comply with. Now, I know that many of these are very important, particularly to protect consumers, but they also need to apply to analogous messaging, calling, and other services provided by large tech companies that fall outside of these frameworks and obligations. Fourthly, our policy settings have to provide incentives to invest. Building telecommunications networks is a very capital intensive, and outside of the NBN, it is built by the telecommunications companies which are owned by the private sector. This is a good thing because this is where the innovation is. However, private sector companies need to make a return on capital that they invest. It was interesting to hear the previous speaker saying that the government needs to look at investments and achieve a return on capital. Well, that is exactly what private companies need to do too. And sometimes it feels like this is an uncomfortable truth that we would like to ignore. But the bottom line is, a company like Telstra is overwhelmingly funded by the retirement savings of millions of Australians, and we have a duty to invest that money in a way that ensures those hard-earned savings are protected and generate a pension over time. The challenge, particularly in remote areas, of course, it is not always feasible to make investments work purely on the basis of an investment from the private sector. Returns on invested capital across the private sector are already at historically low levels and in most cases below the cost of capital. But at the same time, we know connectivity is critical for those communities and increasingly so, as it is for the ag sector. So we need to find and support more ways of investing with co-investments to deliver better outcomes. And that's why initiatives such as the government's mobile black spots programs, the regional connectivity program, the peri-urban mobile program, the STAND program, and many others are so important. It's also important, though, that network operators are encouraged to compete, as this provides consumers choice and it promotes innovation. One of the ways we do this as operators is to differentiate, as you do in your own businesses. We differentiate in the market, and in our industry, we differentiate in telecommunications technology leadership. Or put it another way, having a better network than our competitors, whether it's coverage, speed, resilience, or other dimensions of performance, or all of the above. The decisions by the operators to invest in specific technologies are driven by those forces, and as a consequence, we do better or worse depending on the decisions that we make. Which brings me to the point about network sharing. Now, yes, there are benefits from operators sharing different aspects of their networks with each other. It can certainly lead to more efficient use of capital and better outcome for customers. In fact, there are many examples where operators have entered into agreements, such as our recently announced network sharing agreement with TPG. And even the ACCC submission to RTIRC recognises the opportunity for commercial network sharing agreements. However, this should not be confused with mandated mobile roaming or mandated neutral hosting. If we go down that path, we may as well nationalise the mobile industry now with another NBN for mobile as we did for home broadband. That's not to say NBN hasn't done a good job. I have the utmost regard for Stephen Rue and his team. However, if you want to kill investment and innovation in mobiles from the private sector, that's the nuclear option you can take. I find it hard to understand how this concept is not grasped. Now, if you as a farmer were obliged to make your paddocks and your feed available to the livestock of another farmer who had not invested in the same way that you had, how do you think you're going to react? Also, when you run out of paddock and feed because that other farmer's livestock has overwhelmed your farm, how likely are you to go and invest in another one only for the same thing to happen again? That's what mobile roaming is all about. Sure, you could come to a commercial arrangement with that other farmer privately where you can design a model that works for both of you, but regulatory open access just makes no sense. It will kill the industry and it will lead to an awful outcome for Australians and Australian farmers, and it will destroy the incentive for invest for companies like Telstra. Fifth and finally, our policy settings have to recognise the interdependencies of critical infrastructure, particularly power. Many types of critical infrastructure are highly interdependent. We've seen the significance of this being recognised through the work of the government in its strengthening of cybersecurity obligations of critical infrastructure operators through the recent SOCI legislation changes. An example of this is that telecommunications, of course, relies on power, and at the same time, other forms of critical infrastructure rely on being connected to the internet, which of course relies on telecommunications, which of course relies on power. This interdependency is a huge issue from a risk management perspective, particularly in a time of crisis, as it means a lot of the country's critical infrastructure is under threat from the knock-on consequences of the same event. For telecommunications, the reality is power outages cause the overwhelming majority of interruptions to our services during emergencies such as floods and bushfires. We have over 40,000 network sites that require constant power, and when the main supply of electricity fails, our battery backup and our generators kick in as a short-term fix. However, let me be clear, it's a short-term fix, and it's literally therefore a race against time until the power comes back. We cannot replace the grid. We're not a power company. If the power company can't solve the problem or the outage, it's unlikely we're going to be able to do it for them. So power companies have a critical role to play in ensuring power resilience for telecommunications as well as for the general community. The other dynamic is the provision of telecommunications requires infrastructure to be located close to where it's being used. In other words, if there is a fire or a flood impacting a community, it is very likely that that same fire and flood will be simultaneously damaging the exact infrastructure that is providing the connectivity to that community. If a bushfire takes out a mobile tower, there is nothing I can do about it. We will lose coverage. And also, as much as I would like it to be different, backup generators and batteries do not work well underwater. As the impacts of climate change worsen, we will need to be more sophisticated and measured in what redundancies are available to keep critical communications open during emergencies. That means recognising the networks are fallible and communities need to be supported in putting in place plans for when that happens. Plans that do not just rely on assuming the power is going to come back and the telecommunications is going to come back as quickly as we might like. So these are my comments on policy, and I certainly agree with Fiona's comments earlier. Now is the time for a substantive discussion on them, but a discussion that doesn't get derailed by the inevitable politicisation ahead of an election. Let me now turn to what Telstra is doing to support regional Australia. Often when we talk about regional connectivity, the size of the challenge means we quickly get caught up in talking about some very big numbers, and we can have a tendency to gloss over them. But there are some very significant investments. For example, over the 5 years to June 2021, Telstra invested $8 billion in our mobile networks nationally, and of that, $3 billion was in regional Australia. During the same time, we invested another $5 billion in our fixed networks. $1.3 billion of that was in regional Australia. We're investing $150 million in the current financial year just to improve experience for our regional customers by upgrading 180 3G-only sites and augmenting capacity at 4G sites. A further $200 million will also be spent for co-investments with government, local communities to improve connectivity and in the bush over the next 4 years. We've also built Australia's largest Internet of Things network, which provides access to critical services for data-intensive primary industries such as agriculture. And more broadly, we've just also made a series of other announcements that we believe will help people in regional and rural Australia in the future. In January, we announced a partnership with US satellite giant Viasat to build and operate the ground infrastructure for the Asia Pacific for their next generation geostationary satellite system. You may have seen also this morning that Viasat has recently announced its intended acquisition of Inmarsat, making it the largest satellite company in the world. We've also announced an initiative that will see us build 20,000 kilometres of intercity dual-path fibre backbone across Australia, with branches off to regional communities. In February, we announced a network sharing deal with TPG that I've already mentioned, and that, subject to regulatory approval, will support TPG's own services to regional Australia and give Telstra access to more spectrum, meaning faster speeds in more locations for Telstra customers. In March, we announced a partnership with OneWeb to use LEOsats, or low orbital satellites, to improve coverage across Australia and Asia. They have huge potential, from backhaul to backup, from enabling the Internet of Things to supporting emergency services, from improving home broadband to supporting agtech. The point is, we have made very significant investments and strategic decisions that will benefit regional and rural Australia for many years to come, and we will continue to do so. I mentioned, though, that one of the challenges with telecommunications is that the physical infrastructure that is providing the telecommunications needs to be as close as possible to the people who are using it. And therefore, what that means, in times of natural disaster, that makes it incredibly vulnerable. I want to give you a sense, therefore, of what these situations mean for our repair crews who are on the front line trying to keep people connected. The floods in southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales have been devastating for hundreds of thousands, including primary producers. Thousands of farms and homes and businesses have been damaged or destroyed. Stock and crop losses are enormous, and tragically some people have lost their lives. We know from experience that rebuilding process is long and hard, but there will be support to customers and communities every step along the way. Telstra is always a part of the broader emergency response from the start, and our repair crews continue to be on the ground today. It was the same during the bushfires 2 years ago. Our teams were there on the front line helping, despite the fact many of them live in the very same communities that were affected and were therefore personally impacted. I'm proud of the way our teams always contribute, whether that be through network restoration efforts, through our people volunteering to help out at evacuation centres, through our operation and financial support of the Red Shield appeal. As Telstra's CEO over the years, I have had the opportunity to visit many regional communities, develop relationships and get a real sense of what makes them tick. As the major provider of telecommunications in Australia alongside the NBN, I admit it's sometimes hard not to get defensive when people raise concerns about connectivity and the performance of Telstra. But at the same time, I know that listening and understanding it is important. And that's why several years ago we established regional advisory committees with representatives from key stakeholders across the country. Those committees have been instrumental in influencing many of the initiatives that we have implemented, and I would like to thank the Honourable Bruce Scott, Wendy Duncan, Ian Donges and Paul Weller, the chairs of those committees who are here with us today. One of the things that they have told us, one of the things they have told me, is that for all of the investment in regional connectivity that has or is taking place, whether it be purchase of spectrum, fibre builds, 5G rollout, satellite launches, technology is only as good as people's understanding of what they can do with it. We also need to get better at helping our customers understand the different technologies available and which ones are best for their individual circumstances or business operations. As part of our effort to improve the way we engage with regional Australia, therefore, I am announcing today our Telstra Connected Communities initiative. This will see a significant expansion in our regional Australia team. It will bring together our regionally based workforce into smaller, more locally focused teams to better listen, respond to the needs of the communities which they serve and which they live in. Put simply, Telstra Connected Communities means more boots on the ground. We will double the number of regional engagement managers, and because customers' needs differ in different regional areas, we will split the existing regional footprint into much more focused regional zones. We will triple the number of highly experienced regional network advisors who will work directly with our regional engagement managers and customers to work out and provide the best connection possible to meet their requirements. We will appoint a remote community advocate who will have access at very senior level, responsible for monitoring the performance of our network every day and better communicate any impacts to the communities in which we operate. We will triple our annual spend on community engagement activities and support organisations such as Chambers of Commerce and other local network groups. And we will also work closely with NBN Local to address digital inclusion, community technology solutions and partner on emergency response and preparedness. Now, of course, we're in Canberra this week after the federal government was handed down, so it would be remiss of me not to comment more on government spending on regional connectivity. We welcomed the government's commitment last week to spend $1.3 billion on regional telecommunications, including supporting initiatives such as those outlined in the Connecting Regional Australia Fund. On top of that, Telstra Investments announced earlier, or I mentioned earlier, we will also put aside another $75 million from the recent part sale of our towers business for additional investment in regional Australia, which will be directed in line with RTIRC's recommendations. By the way, I note that our competitors have not done likewise, but then again, I'm not surprised because in regional and rural Australia, Telstra with NBN is typically the only telco that shows up. The issues that we face are challenging, the feedback that we get is challenging, and we do not always get it right. But we are always there, we are always listening, we are always looking for solutions and always putting our money where our mouth is. So thank you again for the opportunity to join with you today. I always describe myself as a technology optimist, so I'm hugely excited by the opportunities ahead. I'm super impressed with the innovation and leadership within our ag sector, and I believe that if we can get the policy settings right, that $100 billion vision is well within our sights. So thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Andy, thank you so much for that speech. There was so much there. Just while we wait for the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, to arrive, I did have one question, and it comes down to this idea of true universal connectivity. You signed an MOU to invest in low Earth orbit satellites to service remote customers. Is this the future of connectivity in the bush? And if so, where do landline phones and 3G, obviously shutting down, fit into that?
Well, thanks very much, Lucy. I mean, I think the point that I always make is that we're not going to see one technology replace another. When you think of the demand and the growth in demand for connectivity, for bandwidth, for lower latency, we need all of these technologies to work in a complementary way to deliver solutions to Australia. The interesting thing about LEO-sats is traditional satellites, geostationary satellites, basically orbit the Earth at about 35,000 kilometres. So getting a signal there and back creates what we call latency. There's a delay in doing that, and also it requires a lot of power to send a signal that far. The typical LEO-sats or low orbital satellites basically orbit at about 800 kilometres, so substantially closer to the Earth, and so removes that latency problem. And there are a number of companies such as Starlink, OneWeb and others that are actually putting up constellations at the moment. And so where that's going to be helpful, particularly in agriculture, where a lot of the applications in agriculture don't necessarily require a lot of data or don't actually require too frequent of a communication. If it's just checking on a soil sensor or something like that, it's a small amount of data which you might want to do once or twice a day. They are a brilliant solution to those types of use cases where there isn't mobile coverage. And because I said, I mean, it is the sad reality, and much as I would like it to be different, Australia is 80% of the land mass of the US with 8% of the population, and rolling out mobile telecommunications is incredibly expensive business because of the infrastructure that is involved. And most people look at a mobile tower and think that's where the cost goes. Actually, the more remote you get, the cost actually goes in connecting that mobile tower back into the rest of the network. And most towers are connected either with fibre or with microwave radios, and so that's where the cost is. And so if we can find some of these other technologies, and so the partnership with OneWeb is incredibly exciting, you know, we think over the next decade there are many more ways in which we can bring connectivity to regional and rural Australia, particularly for the benefit of primary producers.
I don't think that
might do that. Question, I could repeat.
Yeah, it's on now. Just on that, why doesn't Telstra sell NBN satellite services? Is that something that's been considered as part of that?
We originally didn't sell NBN satellite services. It is a geostationary satellite, and candidly, the performance of the satellite wasn't at a level that we felt was something that we wanted to put our brand on, as the bottom line. And of course, one of the challenges is that as the retailer of a service, a customer will interpret that level of service according to the retailer, not necessarily what sits behind it. And so we wanted to see improvements in the NBN satellite service before we would put that on our list of things that we would sell. I announced last September that we will offer a satellite service from 2023, so from next calendar year. Whether that's an NBN satellite service, whether that's a Viasat geostationary satellite, whether that's a LEO-sat with OneWeb, we haven't yet determined. But satellites do have complications, and but the good news is there are next generations of these technologies that are coming which will improve. And I do believe, in fairness to NBN, I think they have improved their satellite service quite a bit over the last few years.
One of the questions from our audience, and I know this has been a big topic in the past, will Telstra consider sharing infrastructure in regional Australia to the other big telcos to increase mobile coverage and increase consumer options?
Yeah, well, I sort of commented on this in my conversation. We have just signed a deal with TPG, which actually takes their coverage from about 96 to 98.8% coverage, which is exactly the sort of thing that I think we do. But we've done it on a commercial basis, which works for them and it works for us. Mandated, implemented roaming, all that will do is to kill investment, kill the incentive to invest, and it will be the wrong model. As I say, you may as well nationalise the mobile network now if we went down that path.
And can you be a bit more specific about the role that would play as an advocate?
In terms of the TPG deal?
Correct.
Yeah, no, essentially what it means is that if you look at the core operators in Australia, within 80% population coverage, we all have our own infrastructure and service our customers. There is then a ring of coverage from 80% to 98%, where what will effectively happen is TPG will retire about 800 towers and sites that they currently have, and they will effectively use our network, where we have 3,700 towers, and substantially more coverage and much better coverage, and that will enable their customers to benefit from that. On the flip side, we will get access to their spectrum, which they will no longer need for that area because they'll be using our infrastructure, and that will improve the service for their customers as well as ours. So it's a win for regional Australians, it's a win for TPG, it's a win for Telstra, it's a win for everybody.
All right, Andy, just a final question. What's next for you, apart from probably a holiday?
Well, I won't be taking too much holiday, thank you, Lucy, but there's lots of things about which I'm passionate: digital leadership, technology innovation, do a lot of work with the government in the space of cyber security and access to critical technologies, and so plenty of things to keep me busy, and I want to continue to make an impact on those, but in a different capacity.
Wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Andy Penn.